Chapter 19, 19.1 Banu Qaynuqa. Peace and quiet was not to be the lot of the Muslims, for as soon as they returned to Medina, the Jews began to plot and conspire against them even more vigorously than before. They could not bear to see the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ dominate the city, and they could not bear to see the Muslims victorious. Night and day their plots and injuries to the Muslims did not cease, and what was worse for the believers was that they slandered Muslim women to the extent that the Prophet ﷺ had to send a messenger to Banu Qaynuqa to tell them to stop injuring Muslims and to observe the treaties between them. Banu Qaynuqa were one of the three large Jewish tribes who lived in Medina. Instead of heeding this warning and observing the treaties that had given them both freedom and security, the answer they sent back was a challenge. Muhammad, they said, do not be deceived because you have met with people who have no knowledge of war. If we fight you, then you shall know what it means to face a warrior race. There was nothing that the Prophet ﷺ could do but meet the challenge. The Muslims besieged the forts of Banu Qaynuqa, and after 15 days of siege they surrendered. Consultations were undertaken on what to do with Banu Qaynuqa. Some suggested that they should be enslaved, while others asked the Prophet ﷺ to show them mercy. In the end it was decided that they should evacuate the city, leaving their weapons behind. They left Medina, heading northwards until they reached Azriat on the border of Ash-Sham and settled there. 19.2 Abu Sufyan skirmishes the outskirts. For a short time there was peace in Medina as potential plotters lay low after Banu Qaynuqa were evacuated. However, Abu Sufyan, hating to remain idle in Mecca after the humiliation of Quraysh, went towards Medina with a group of men, and on the outskirts of the city came across one of the supporters tilling his land with the aid of a friend. They killed the man, burned some palm trees, and fled. Abu Sufyan thought this would raise the prestige of Quraysh among the Arabs and make them realize that Quraysh did not fear the Muslims and still had the power to strike at them. The Prophet ﷺ with some of his companions went after Abu Sufyan and his followers. The closer the Prophet ﷺ came, the faster Abu Sufyan fled to avoid the encounter, and, in order to go as fast as possible, they threw away their provisions onto the road. The pursuers picked them up, and the Prophet ﷺ, seeing that Abu Sufyan would avoid them at all costs, turned back. This raid did not raise the prestige of Quraysh as Abu Sufyan had hoped, but on the contrary, his flight before the Prophet ﷺ only proved that the Muslims had become a power to be reckoned with. The tribes around Medina who levied protection dues on the summer journey of Quraysh to Ash-Sham feared that if this trade was threatened by the Muslims, Quraysh would take another route and they would be deprived of their revenue. They resented that the Muslims, who only a few months earlier had been fugitives seeking shelter, should defeat the great Quraysh and exile the tribe of Banu Qaynuqa. They decided to attack the Muslims in the hope that they would gain fame among the Arabs and earn the undying gratitude of the illustrious Quraysh. Accordingly, they made preparations and gathered together a large war host. Hearing of these movements, the Prophet ﷺ thought it would be better to go out to meet them instead of waiting for them to raid Medina. He set out at the head of a group of his companions, but whenever the tribes heard of his approach, they dispersed or fled to the mountains. Again and again they gathered, then fled when they saw him approaching. The Jewish tribes of Medina took note of this and feared for themselves, especially when one of them who used to slander Muslims, particularly Muslim women, was assassinated. The Jews went to the Prophet ﷺ to complain. He pointed out that had this man not kept on slandering people, no harm would have come to him. Then he called them to make a new treaty and to respect it. They accepted, for such treaties gave them all the rights given to the Muslims, but, cowed and resentful, they waited and bided their time to make mischief. 19.3 Quraysh's trade problem. Quraysh were in a dilemma. Their main source of income was commerce, and their main trade route was past Medina to the sea coast. Many of the coastal tribes had made pacts and treaties with the Prophet ﷺ, so they no longer protected the trade of Quraysh from attacks by the Muslims. If they did not trade, they would eat up their capital. If they did, the Prophet ﷺ was sure to threaten their caravans on their way to Ash-Sham. After holding counsel among themselves, they decided to try another route, through Najd and Iraq. So they prepared a caravan carrying gold and silver to trade within Ash-Sham. One of them chanced to tell this to a Muslim, who went in turn and related it to the Prophet ﷺ, who sent Zayd ibn al-Haritha at the head of 100 men. They intercepted the caravan and brought back the gold and silver. The Prophet ﷺ divided it equitably among them after allotting 1/5 to the needy, the poor, orphans, widows, those in debt for Allah's sake, relatives, and in freeing slaves. The leader of the caravan was brought to the messenger, who spoke to him of Islam. The man liked what he heard and became a Muslim. Chapter 20, 20.1 Learning the Precepts of the Quran. In the more clement climate of Medina, in freedom and without secrecy or fear, the Messenger ﷺ taught the Muslims the spiritual and moral meanings of the precepts and stories found in the Quran. He also taught them how to act and what was expected of them as slaves of Allah. They loved the Quran and cherished it. Whenever a verse was sent down, they studied it and learnt it by heart. The verses were written down on parchment, bone, or wood. They realized that it was not enough only to cherish the Quran, but that it was a code to live by. So they studied the Quran with the full realization that it was to be the law of their lives. Abu Mas'ud relates that, when a man among us learnt 10 verses of the Quran, he kept practicing what he had learnt before learning the next 10. The Quran teaches that piety is not merely a matter of rising and bowing in prayers or turning one's face towards Mecca. Much more is involved. It is charity in all its aspects, in giving money, in being kind, in freeing slaves. It is to keep one's word, to be patient in sickness and adversity, and to be firm and strong at the moment of trial. A Muslim is part of a community, and it is in his daily behaviour within the community that he can serve Allah best. A Muslim has to learn how to live with people, for it is in serving his fellow man that he serves Allah best. It is in the give and take of the relationships of everyday life that a man is really tested. He has to learn how to be truthful without hurting other people's feelings, to be good without being weak and submissive, to be unselfish and charitable without being prodigal, to be learned or gifted without being conceited, and to be granted more than other men without being proud. 20.2 Example of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. The messenger living among them day by day showed by his shining example that it was possible for a man to rise to great heights. He was so intelligent, granted so much, and yet was so modest, so considerate and tactful. The Muslims loved him dearly and studied his every word and acted in order to emulate him. The messenger ﷺ did not rush them, but taught with kind, patient care, teaching each man according to his ability to learn. With beginners he was most lenient, and ordered those he sent to teach other tribes to be lenient, and to make things easy for them. 20.3 Ali's Wisdom. But with his cousin Ali ibn Abi Talib, whom he had brought up since he was a little boy, he went into deep and great matters, and expected Ali to be able to answer his highly learned questions. Ali had the makings of a great scholar in him, and the messenger saw to it that he became the greatest of the scholars of Islam. One day Ali, who was yet young in years, was unable to answer one of the messenger's difficult suppositions, for he consulted him about legislative and juridical matters. When he was unable to answer, the messenger ﷺ then placed his hand over Ali's breast and prayed for him. From that day Ali was able to answer any question concerning Islam, and was of deep and sound judgment. After the messenger passed away, each of the 3 caliphs who preceded Ali used to send for him whenever they had a difficult case. Both Abu Bakr and Umar made him their counsellor, and Abu Bakr, the first caliph, who was one of the 2 wisest men in Quraysh, used to say, "I seek the aid of Allah against a question that Abu al-Hasan," a reverential way of referring to Ali, would be unable to answer. Chapter 21. 21.1 Quraysh prepares an army. Quraysh, who had suffered defeat and humiliation before all the Arabs, could not rest or allow the Muslims to rest. Their trade had been threatened and was in constant danger. They had to avenge themselves, retrieve their prestige, and consequently regain their hold upon the coastal tribes and make safe their main trade route. The very next day after Badr, they had allotted all the money gained by Abu Sufyan's trade in Ash-Sham to arm and equip an army capable of regaining for them all they had lost of influence and honour. The great army they prepared was divided into 3 groups of 1,000 men each. They were all Meccans except 100 men who came from Taif, and all were well equipped and fully armed. They had 200 horses and 3,000 camels, and they had 700 armour-bearers. The women of Quraysh, led by Hind, the wife of Abu Sufyan, whose father, brother and loved ones had been killed at Badr, insisted against the men's protests on attending the battle. "If you fail," the women threatened their near ones, "we will be taken as slaves by the enemy." Thus each man was placed in the position of having to fight for his wife, sister or daughter. His honour was at stake. Al-Abbas, the Prophet ﷺ's uncle, was with Quraysh as they prepared this great army. He knew every detail about it, and in spite of being a loyal Qurayshi, something prompted him to write a letter to his nephew, warning him of the approach of the army and giving him all the details about it. He gave the letter to an Arab to deliver, and the man reached Medina 3 days later and gave the letter to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ confided its contents to his intimates, then sent 2 brothers as scouts to find out what they could. They came back, bringing information that confirmed Al-Abbas's letter. 21.2 Muslims debate the matter of defence. Quraysh marched on until they were only 5 miles from Medina. The Muslims slept in the mosque that night in a state of alert, for they feared that Quraysh would strike during the night. When morning came, the Prophet ﷺ called the nobles of Medina together and held a council. The Prophet ﷺ was of the opinion that they should remain in the city and fortify and defend it. Abdullah ibn Ubay, who had been one of the chiefs of Yathrib, and who had much experience in war and many followers, was of the same opinion. He said, "Prophet of Allah, we have fought in this manner before. We used to fortify the city, then place the women and children within forts from which they threw stones at the enemy while we met them with our swords. Our city, Prophet of Allah, is a virgin city. No enemy has ever set foot upon its soil without being defeated. The words of Abdullah ibn Ubay found favour with the Prophet's counsellors as well as the Prophet himself, but some fiery-hearted youths who had not fought at Badr and longed to engage the enemy, and some of the men whom Allah had granted victory against seemingly impossible obstacles at Badr, said that if they remained inside Medina, Quraysh would say, "We have besieged Muhammad ﷺ and his associates inside the walls of Yathrib, and none dared come out to us. Moreover, these men would burn the fields and come to raid us again and again." They had witnessed the victory at Badr when they were less numerous, less experienced, poorly armed, and away from their city and people. Would he who gave them victory then not grant them victory now when they were in more favourable circumstances? Surely Allah was capable of that. The deep faith and courage that prompted them to speak moved all who heard them, and now many were in favour of going out to meet Quraysh, even though Quraysh had come to them with an army they had never seen the like of before. The Messenger ﷺ accepted the opinion of the majority. Ever careful to follow the precepts of the Quran, he settled affairs after taking counsel. He told them to get ready for battle and promised them that if they were patient and persevering, victory would be theirs. Then he entered his house to dress for battle. After the Prophet ﷺ went in, Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh, the chief of al-Abbas, who was in favour of staying in Medina, spoke to the youths whose fiery speeches had induced the Prophet ﷺ to decide to fight the enemy outside the city. He said that they had pressed the Prophet ﷺ to do what he did not like, and perhaps this was not a good thing. The youths reflected on this, and as soon as the Prophet ﷺ came out to them, dressed in armour, they went to him and said, "Prophet of Allah, we should not have differed from you. Do what you think best. We should not have pressed you. The decision belongs to Allah and you." The Prophet ﷺ said, "I did suggest it, but you refused. No prophet, once he wears armour, shall take it off again until Allah decides between him and his enemy. So listen to what I command and obey, and if you are patient and persevere, victory shall be yours." We perceive in the Prophet ﷺ's refusal to go back on his decision strict adherence to the teaching of the Quran. Once you take a decision, then trust in Allah. Surah 3, verse 159. A Muslim should not panic or be hesitant, but should trust in Allah, who rules over all. He should take his time to decide, but once he has decided, he does not waver, but marches forward in the firm belief that the conclusion of all issues rests with him who rules all. 21.3. Abdullah ibn Ubay deserts. While placing the army groups in positions of combat, the Messenger ﷺ saw a battalion whose people he could not recognize. He asked who they were, and on being informed that they were the Jewish allies of Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, he said, "One does not seek the aid of the polytheists against the polytheists." Then he commanded that they return. Many Jews then believed that Uzair was the son of Allah. They did not worship Allah alone. The Prophet ﷺ needed men and weapons. He needed the support of Ibn Ubay, but what was more important to him than men and materials was to keep the principles of Islam uncompromised. At the darkest moment he would refuse aid if it meant the least compromise. The allies of Abdullah ibn Ubay considered this an affront and went to him and said, "Look, Muhammad did not listen to your advice but to his boys, and now he drives your allies away." Abdullah ibn Ubay was so offended that immediately before the battle he withdrew with his followers, diminishing substantially the Muslim ranks. There remained only the true Muslims. They were only 700 in number, and they had to face 3,000 Qurayshis, well prepared and burning for revenge.